One question that comes up all the time, especially when you talk about, innovation and digital transformation and doing agile and weekly deployment cycles and all this kind of fancy fun stuff is like, everyone's like, hey, that sounds great. But we work in a highly regulated industry, and we have compliance and auditors and things like that to deal with. And, well, two things. One, everyone's got some governance to put up with. To be fair, some people have a lot more that are a lot more important, right? Like at the beginning of the spectrum, you just have self-governance, right? And this is often enterprise architecture and policy that you've put in place to just ensure goodness. A lot of this governance, you need to constantly be revisiting it to see if it's helpful, right? So back when you were dealing with, I don't know, maybe even all the way back to Corba. But, in enterprise software, we're basically always building, let's say, three types of apps. We're always building what they used to call departmental apps. Nowadays, they kind of call them low-code apps, right? But we're putting some amount of code into something that a group or a team of people uses just for some kind of regular function that they do. It might be approving a workflow or something like that. You see a lot of workflow apps and things like that. Now, low code can mean all sorts of other things nowadays. I'm not an analyst anymore, so pardon the definition. But oftentimes, these applications just go crazy and they grow like weeds. And so you want to impose a certain amount of governance because people have to maintain them and add features to them. And they often don't have a lot of forward thinking about how are we going to take care of this thing. And you get kind of like, if you remember that William Gibson book, I forget, I think it's the Bridge trilogy, right? Like they just let people build like a whole town on top of a bridge. And so it's just crazy patchwork of things, right? You need some more governance on those things. So the second type of governance or applications you're building are basically like distributed applications. I mean, most enterprise applications are actually distributed applications, right? Like components of code and backend services that are interacting with each other over APIs, all sort of coordinating together for some purpose or around a workflow. And then third, you have, this is the big innovation of the web and mobile, is you have web applications that are being delivered. I mean, they're distributed apps too, but they have a front end that goes to consumers or customers in the form of an app. This is what most people think of software as. Over those three types of architectures, right? An enterprise architecture is talking about how we shape those applications, how we go through change approval processes, right? And we've had Corba, then we had just like Perl and CGI bin integrating with databases. There was that guy with the big fluffy dog. I think he was at Harvard or something. And then we had SOA and ESBs that were going to handle that back in J2EE. And then the Rails people came and we simplified all that in XML and the JSON. And then we got the containers and the containers turned to Kubernetes, and we've had a platform as a service, and boom, here we are now. So we've got all that kind of stuff, and you kind of need to govern, again, as with the rapid application development things, the low-code things, you've got to govern, we're making good choices that fit with the security requirements have, the manageability of it so we can run it in production, but also with a way of reducing technical debt and kind of fitting in, the manners that our software has to fit in. So you've got that governance. People often talk about that governance. That governance is a little bit easier because you can revisit it frequently and think about, do we need to be doing that? And there's a great, I think I've cited this before, but there's a good example from Target, and I should remember her name, but one of the DevOps people, she speaks frequently in the DevOps world. She was at Target and she said, we wanted to introduce, I'm going to get the example all wrong. I should find it and put a reference to it, but I won't. We wanted to use a new framework, and I had to go to multiple meetings with the new framework architecture board, and it was an awful experience. And so I started asking, why do I have to do this? Why do we have this governance in place? No one really knew why. And so she made the suggestion, so why do we not do that? And I'm sure that required some more meetings, but people realized that we don't need this heavy-handed governance. We have these rules that no longer apply. The other type of governance that people are talking about is actual external governance, laws that you need to follow, regulations you need to follow. And the extreme example of this is jet planes that are flying, literal rockets and things like that, where I guess it's self-imposed governance, but you have a governance of safety and things must work. And these are rules that you don't really have the option to follow or not. They're in banking has tons of regulations. Pharmaceuticals, annoyingly, if you live in Europe, I understand that the end goal is laudable and great. But annoyingly, you've got GDPR, which means every single new website you visit, you've got to click on some box to get it away, to agree or disagree with how they're using your data, so that you can just go use your site again. It's a great goal, but it's, if you can imagine, just imagine every time you even looked at someone when you were walking in the street, you had to click on something to agree that the memories that they had from looking at you, you agreed that they could retain those and use them, and vice versa. It's kind of a bummer. But that kind of regulation is a lot more difficult and onerous. And often when people are asking this question, and I'll say regulations, what they're saying is that, like, it's so much work to deal with this regulatory stuff that, like, we are constrained by that, and it makes us hard to be innovative and change how we're doing things. So therefore, we should not change, and we should just keep doing the things we are. And I don't know, not our fault. So we'll just keep doing stuff. We'll go through that as my old friend Andrew Clay Schaefer likes to say, we want all these great benefits, but we actually also don't want to change, and we want it for free. I think there's a way of looking at regulations that I've noticed people doing that is helpful and not having an excuse to stay the way you are, not change. I was trying not to pull too many knots there, but also is actually allows you to make that experience better. And that is, over contextualize it again. A lot of what we're doing when we're trying to have a more product way of doing software, right? Again, all the stuff I talk about, if I remember, I'll put a link up here to a definition of all this stuff that I'm always talking about, what digital transformation is, what it means to use software to be a product-driven organization. What we're focusing on is, how do we improve the customer, the user experience? How do we build applications that improve that experience so that we can improve the way that we do business? So when it comes to regulations, a lot of what people don't realize is that regulations, auditors, being compliant is part of that customer experience. They are a stakeholder. They are a customer. They're a person that you're trying to comply with, right? They're actually something that's important. Now, if they're not important, that's a whole other track you need to set up, that, like, these regulations no longer are important and actually they're not a good feature to have in our software, so to speak, right? There's something that need to be revisited. Now, that takes many years and a long time, but that's another thing that you should start ramping up, is take your regulation stuff through a product management cycle and see if it's useful or not. That's a whole other realm. But it gets to this point of thinking about, these are features in the product that I'm building. Let's go to banking, for example, right? So a lot of the regulations that banks follow are really beneficial to me as a customer. The idea that they need to keep a certain amount of cash on the books and not lend it all out is great for preventing runs on the banks and making sure that I have my money. The security that they put in, although it may be really annoying to have two-factor authentication and things like that, is great, because I would rather put up with the extreme annoyance of having to log in and using two-factor authentication than my money disappearing because someone stole it. Totally cool, right? Like, so all of these regulatory things that they follow, having to have separation of duties so that people aren't, like, stealing money, all of that security, that financial security that I get, is a tremendous feature. Actually complying with those regulatory things is something that I may not realize I want as a customer, but I do actually want. And then as another stakeholder, right, the shareholders of bank, right? Like if whenever some big amount of fraud or some problems come because regulations were not followed or because governance was not followed well enough, and then the value of the bank falls and the shareholders, their value falls, they would also appreciate plenty of governance and regulation internally. Also, if you're an employee of that system, right, and governance is not followed and bad things happen, you also appreciate governance. And sort of segueing into the next thing, right? So think about that governance not as something that's annoying, but as a feature that you're delivering, right? Like, it's something that's very valuable. And, I'm always reminded of I have a sister-in-law who she's a regulator, if you will. She works for a big government contractor, and she's actually an auditor of auditors. So her job, at least at the time when this example comes up, was to make sure that people were following the process and following governance for projects they were working on. And I remember one Thanksgiving, we were with her, and she had to break away to her little home office a lot because someone had screwed up. One of the people she was auditing had filled out the forms wrong or whatever. They weren't in compliance. And so she had to go back and check on that and, fix it, right? Which took away from her holiday time. And so think about that use case, right? Like we have a customer here, a person, and somehow our software, our product has failed them because they're having to go and do this rework. As you start to think about complying with governance and regulation, not only think about people like us, like with banking and telcos and information control and flights that we want to arrive on time. And then if the flight's late, we want to be able to track where our bag is and get refunds and things like that. Governance is actually really nice when it benefits you. It's kind of like the definition of legacy software. Legacy software, the definition I use, Michael Feathers has a much better one that everyone uses, totally fine. But the legacy software definition that I use is it's software that you have to change that you really don't want to change. Now, the reasons you don't want to change it is because it's not testable and you're scared of it. But if you think about it, if there's software that you need to change and you're totally cool with changing it, you just call it your software. You never call it legacy software. But, similarly, right, like governance, no one really thinks of it as governance if it benefits them. They only call it governance or regulation if they don't want to do it. So you got to change your mind around to think about it as a beneficial thing. So back to my sister-in-law, right? Like someone should have thought about her as an end user and more importantly for the 5 whys and root cause analysis, why did filling out those original forms and doing that original governance, why was it possible to screw it up, right? Probably because it was a manual process. And this is a big regulatory thing, is most of the regulatory processes are extremely manual, right? I think the tool chain most auditors use is called Microsoft Office. They use email, they use spreadsheets, probably PowerPoint for whatever reason, proving my maxim that most PowerPoint is a Word document that has accidentally been printed in landscape. It's a manual process where you go interview people and you have to trust what they say. Whereas what people have been finding when they use things like the Tanzu application service, when they use kind of that GitOps approach to building their distributed applications on top of Kubernetes and other things, is that the extreme amount of automation that you have, you can actually use that as a way to make your governance, your regulations much, much better and make it so that my sister-in-law doesn't have to work on the vacation, that the person that she's auditing, their job is more successful. And the way that you do this, we have one of our customers is the U.S. Air Force. They were able to rely on, again, it's what we call it nowadays, this kind of GitOps mentality where everything that happens is basically version controlled and checked in. And you're automating your build so much, and you can keep these promises of like, every time I build this or deploy it, it's the same thing. It's idempotent, if you will. And our cloud native infrastructure, the Tanzu Kubernetes grid or the Tanzu application server that we're running, it enforces this way of working, right? Like if you remember how Kubernetes works, Kubernetes has this, it kind of borrows this, or not borrows it, but it builds on the idea from Puppet and Chef and Salt and Ansible, where what you're doing is you're enforcing this desired state, right? So Kubernetes will go about and it'll kind of check on each of the nodes and it'll say like, hey, are your containers in a healthy state? I guess, whatever, the nodes, the pods, the containers, are your containers and are your pods in a healthy state? Are you in the intended set of configuration? And if they're not, it gets rid of them, or as we used to say, kills them, and it puts the healthy state in. So you're guaranteed to enforce that desired state. So let's extrapolate from that, as the U.S. Air Force and so many other organizations are doing when they automate governance and regulation, is you can basically say, we know and we can prove, because we have that whole chain of trust, we have that whole build chain that we've automated, whether it's with the Tanzu build service or all sorts of other things. We can guarantee the chain of responsibility. We have this chain of promises and trust. We can demonstrate what's been followed. You don't have to just get word of mouth and email that you print out and put in a PowerPoint or a SharePoint thing somewhere. You can prove by querying the system all this regulation and governance. Who did what, who approved what, which frameworks we use, date it, all that stuff. Just a few lines of code to generate reports. I say that jokingly, but it's possible. So we remove using Office as a tool chain. But then the next thing that we can do that the U.S. Air Force figured out is normally what would happen with the U.S. Air Force, following a more traditional way of deploying apps, is on a long application cycle, also using the usual way of building from the ground up. the auditors had to check everything from the hardware to the software to the virtualization to the middleware to the actual application that was changing. I exceeded my frame over here. That it would take them months and months to audit that entire stack for each release, right? And then, as always, this has a vicious cycle that because it's going to take 2 months to do the complete auditing, we want to put more and more features in because we've got this window. Is it a fallacy of sunk cost? It's almost the result. It's the fallacy of like, because it takes so long to push something through a window, through a release window, and so much effort, we want to push more and more through that window so that we have that baseline cost that we can get more stuff through. I don't know my biases and system thinking well enough to know what that's called, but what that means is you pile more and more features on, which makes it take a month and a week, and then a month and 2 weeks. And then because you have so much stuff, it takes 6 months all of a sudden, right? And you kind of forget this and you end up with these huge cycles. What the US Air Force realized is that because we have that chain of trust, I keep throwing these things out here, right? But we're following that GitOps way of doing things, and we can build up this trust that things have not changed or that we can track things. We can automate those reports, but also because we can demonstrate to auditors, we can prove, because it is the case, that that entire stack of hardware and software and even middleware actually hasn't changed in this past week of code, that all that's changed are these application lines of code, and maybe not even that much if we're doing it on a weekly or a daily cycle. The auditors actually only need to look at that little bit of code, right? Now, it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? Like, there's all sorts of other tests and things like that. The point is that if you actually go to your auditors and you demonstrate that you're automating a lot of the things that they normally would check manually, a lot of things they normally need to check, you can probably find a huge double-digit percentage of things that you no longer need to manually audit, and maybe even audit it at all on each cycle. You might have one gigantic big audit, right? But when you're going through these various cycles, you can more easily think about, you can think about reducing that audit cycle. Put it all together. That will speed up your audit cycle, make governance and working in a regulated environment not such a big deal. It'll actually improve the customer experience, the auditor experience, right? Because they will benefit from that automation and they won't have to do so much manual work and work after hours and work on the weekend. And I mean, I don't know if anyone likes doing that manual work. It's just kind of work, right? And instead, they can do the more interesting work of, thinking about how they program this setup, right? I mean, I don't know what auditors find interesting, but I would imagine it's more intellectually stimulating if you don't do all this boring manual work underneath. In fact, it might be more interesting for the auditors to really understand the regulations and think about how we can map that back to the process that we do. The auditors should probably be product managers of regulations and think about how we implement and do the technical and the business viability of regulations that we have. Finally, I think business-wise, that allows you to deliver on. There actually is a huge business benefit to regulation and compliance. There's the business benefit that my bank is solvent and my money is there and people don't steal it and so forth and so on. To the shareholders, that you're following regulations and therefore the company doesn't get caught up in fraud and have all sorts of. If you're my age, you remember when the banks went through a global financial crisis and all sorts of crazy stuff happened, which is largely a failure of governance. You could call it of wise governance, that things have been loosened, but whatever. We don't need to get too historic. If you're an existing large organization or an organization that's willing to spend the time and money to work in a regulated industry, complying with regulations is a gigantic competitive advantage for organizations, right? So there's always a lot of discussion about fintech, right? Like startups that are trying to revolutionize how banking is done. And if you look at them, like I go and look up and even sign up for these financial startups quite a bit, like they don't really ever change the fundamental nature of banking, right? Like at their core, at least from retail banking, they more or less do exactly the same thing, right? I was complaining in my Software Defined Talk podcast a couple episodes ago that like, what I would like these fintech startups to innovate on is a much higher percentage rate of interest, right? Like if their software is terrible, but I get like the best you can get in the States nowadays is like 1.98% return on cash. But if they gave me 5%, like that would be phenomenal, right? Like that's all the innovation that I want. Who really cares if they help me find reoccurring subscription things, right? I mean, I guess some people do, but there are maybe some interesting innovations if you need help budgeting and saving and things like that, which I think gets to the point that it's easy to do innovation around the edges in banking, right? And there is a tremendous amount of things you can do there, right? Over here in Europe, you've got, I forget what they call it, but there's the open banking thing. So if you can set it up so that you could actually become a financial dashboard for all of your things, that's an interesting innovation to have, right? That you can add at the software layer. All sorts of things, finding those reoccurring things, suggesting subscriptions you could cancel, helping you out with budgeting, as a lot of these fintech things do. But if you think about it, I mean, that's just moving pixels around the screen. Those are pretty simple things to implement. What's difficult is to set yourself up as a bank, right? And to comply with all the regulatory things. And in fact, you see with a lot of startups that they actually use an established bank on the back end to do things. So like Goldman Sachs, for example, is actually the bank that backs several interesting fintech startups that are going on here and there, right? The Apple Card is an interesting, innovative thing that's backed by Goldman Sachs on the back end. Financial startups do all sorts of interesting stuff. Let me get back to the point here, that if you can efficiently comply with regulations in your industry and you are good at that, that is a strategic advantage that you have over your other incumbents who don't do it very well, who actually, because they are not treating it as a feature that they're always refining and getting better at, as I've gone over, that means that you will be able to innovate faster than your competitors if they're not paying attention to that. And it also means that when other people come in, when startups or, the big robot dog companies of Amazon and Google and, the Facebooks, the Fangs, or the whatever they are, as they want to do, try to just enter more and more businesses, they also will have to spend. That's a barrier to entry that they have, that you can use as a defensive and even a competitive position, that you are much better at that regulatory stuff than other people. I think in summary, the way that you deal with governance and regulation is to fully embrace it and think about working backwards, right? How do I make this a competitive advantage? How do I make this a core asset that I have for my business? And to make it a core asset, that means that I'm always innovating and evolving it. That means that I'm doing it as efficiently as possible. Now, if I go look at how most governance stuff is done, it is not done efficiently, right? It hasn't been revisited. It's this weird corner that no one likes, as we started off with. So we don't treat it as a stakeholder. We don't treat it as an area we can innovate in and go automate and make it so that people like my sister-in-law have a better customer experience, right? And then it turns out that technology, that the way that us programmers, or you programmers, the system administrator people, when you put the Tanzu stack in place, and I think there's maybe other ways of doing it, but I wouldn't know anything about them. But when you're putting this very Tanzu Kubernetes grid and Tanzu application service and the Tanzu build service in place, all these things, you actually are enabling this tremendous way of doing governance and regulation. And so you can actually fulfill all these needs that you have, and governance and regulation is not a big problem at all. So, if you're interested in exploring that more, I've got a couple of recommendations for you. One, I've written up a lot of these concepts in the 2 books that I have. I think that I would recommend, I think I cover this in Monolithic Transformation. It might be the Business Bottleneck, but let me go ahead and refer Monolithic Transformation, a book you can get for free. It's only 80 or 90 pages. You're not going to spend a lot of time reading about digital imperatives and all that front matter that you have in books. You can get that for free. Download the PDF. And also, if you want to actually kind of start talking to this stuff, you can book office hours with us and at VMware Tanzu. It can be an hour, it could be half a day, whatever it may be. And we'll start to walk you through thinking about this and kind of putting together the strategy. Now, listen, we ultimately want you to be a customer and buy stuff from you. So we're going to try to hustle you in that direction. But if you're kind of cognizant of that, you can figure out getting some free consulting, and actually it'd be enjoyable on both sides to kind of explore and discuss things. And you can click on a link right here to go figure out and sign up for those things. Also, I mentioned Kubernetes many times. If you want to get some free training, I mean, that's a foundation for a lot of this stuff, is to get Kubernetes in place and then kind of layer on things like the Tanzu build service and the approach that we do in the Tanzu application service, and by using Spring and standardizing on your approach, you can go to kube.academy, get a bunch of free training. Also, if you want to click up here, you can go to tanzu.vmware.com/developer and really dive into what the technical stack for all of this stuff looks like. It'll all be, can you tell I've been watching a lot of my kids' Minecraft videos and things like that? It'll all be down here to click on as well. And with that, if you want to see the archives for all of this, you can go to tanzutalk.com. And I always appreciate you not only giving me feedback, but helping spread this stuff to other people. So if you've got people you've been complaining about regulation and governance and compliance with, send it along to them. I don't know. If you've talked to a compliance person or an auditor, send it to them and be like, does this sound crazy? Or is this something us looking into so that we can work closer together and I can move pixels on a screen for you? And with that, we'll see everyone next time.